This episode is brought to you by Babbel. So any long-time listeners of the podcast out there won't be too surprised to learn that we often have trouble with other languages, whether it be mispronouncing Welsh place names, reading Old English poems, or struggling our way through Scandinavian myths. Going forward, however, I've decided there's a little room for improvement, and for that I've been getting a little help from Babbel, one of the world's top language learning apps. Babbel's lessons are designed by real language teachers and are scientifically proven to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel aims to teach you practical conversation skills that you can use in real-life situations, whether they be travel, business, relationships, or more. One of my future, and probably over-ambitious plans for the podcast is to cover some of the works of Germanic heroic epics, such as the Nibelungenlied, and given how well pronouncing words from those works has gone for us in the past, I thought using Babbel to help me learn a little German might be a good idea. And it turns out they even have audio recognition tests, so there's half a chance that I might actually pronounce a word correctly once in a while.
Wie geht es Ihnen?
Wie geht es Ihnen?
So whether you want to avoid mispronouncing words in front of the internet, or you just want to say Ich bin Charles, wo ist die Toilette on your holiday, Babbel has a lesson plan for you. Babbel's app is easily accessible on your phone or tablet, so you can always fit in a lesson around your daily schedule. And if that's not enough, they even offer a 20-day money-back guarantee. So click on the link in the description to get 60% off your subscription today. So, you know what they say, Crofty, about moving house being one of the most stressful things that you can do in your life? I didn't really believe that until recently, when mysteriously it seemed to coincide with me trying to move house of all things.
I mean, I could have told you that, yeah, it is quite stressful. But then I did move countries as well, so...
Yeah, you kind of one-up me there, so I don't have... I'm going to have to move to... Where's the opposite direction? I was going to say, where's the opposite direction to Japan on the other side of the globe? And then the answer from England, and then the answer was Japan. Yes, hello everybody. Welcome to Mythillogical. I'm, of course, your host, Charles, and I'm here with my pet spider friend, Crofty.
It's the nicest thing you've called me in a while.
And yes, this is the show that covers all things mythology and folklore, and we're in a bit of a weird intersection of those two today. But today is an interesting recording session because I'm as I said before in the middle of moving house, and smart guy that I am, Crofty. Do you want to know what I did with my internet?
Did you cancel it?
I cancelled it so that it would come on in my new house yesterday, and my furniture is not being delivered to that house until tomorrow. So for a while, it was looking like I was going to have to camp out in my new, completely empty house and record there, just sat on the floor, no furniture, nothing to work with.
You thought that through.
Yeah, and but I was thinking, I was like, you know what, I'm going to lean into this. Let's make this into a really bad bit. And what I'll do is I'll get a tiny little table, like a teeny tiny table, and sit cross-legged like I'm at primary school during assembly, and record it on there. One of my rooms has got this big built-in wardrobes that have all got mirrored fronts, so I was going to sit in front of them and take a picture of myself whilst I was recording, just to show how ridiculous the situation was. And then my internet provider told me, oh, actually, we're going to switch it over 2 days later. So I'm sat in my boring office, sat here robbed of the opportunity to make a very bad comedy bit out of that.
I feel cheated.
And now I'm desperately trying to turn that into a bit about how I've been robbed of doing a bad comedy bit. And I appear to be failing. So what are we talking about today then, Crofty?
We are going to be talking today about a West African legend, the Trickster Anansi the Spider, and how he developed as he moved to Jamaica, which is where things get very serious and dark.
Yes. Unfortunately, there are going to be a few more serious parts. of today's episode, both in terms of my section and Crofty's section. So I'm just going to warn people about that in advance. There's going to be some relatively extensive discussions of both the slave trade and slavery in the Caribbean.
And for those who enjoy our sense of humour on this episode, all three of you, this is going to be a serious one. We will not be cracking jokes.
Yeah, any comedic value in this particular episode is entirely limited to the things that I said a few moments ago. I to be fair, there will be a few moments of levity in terms of the actual stories involving Anansi that we're going to be telling today, but outside of that, this episode will have a few more grim aspects. So, for anyone at home who is unaware, Anansi is a trickster folk figure who originates in the tales of the West African Akan peoples, and who is most commonly depicted as a spider. I believe in the Akan language, his name directly translates to spider. Like many tricksters, he is marked by being physically weak, and generally relies on his cunning and trickery to overcome his often larger and more dangerous opponents. Within Akan culture, and more specifically in the mythology of the Ashanti nation, he plays a key role as a mediator between humans and the supreme god, and has been termed by many academics as a crossroad figure, who exists between the world of men and that of the gods. Now, at the same time, he's also a contradictory figure, who, in line with his trickster nature, acts as a tester of societal norms and rules. In his interactions with both humans and gods, he is often seen to be a destructive being, ruled by his emotions and self-interest. However, despite these destructive qualities, in many circumstances his actions are seen to have brought about the present state of the world and many of the norms of society, which lends him a role as something of an inadvertent creator figure. And going beyond his appearances in the Ashanti spider stories, Anansi has also migrated elsewhere in the world. So as Crofty said before, during the transatlantic slave trade, many Anansi stories were brought by slaves to parts of the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and Haiti. Here he transformed in many ways into a symbol of resistance against the oppressive plantation regime that slaves there were subject to. In terms of our previous familiarity with this particular figure, Crofty, am I right in saying that this is a figure that you really weren't that familiar with before we started the research?
Yes, this is in fact the first episode where I had no knowledge at all. My knowledge of the name, Anansi, was literally the band Skunk Anansi, which now, reading more and learning about the subject, now adds a whole new dimension to their music to me. But yeah, I was not aware of the figure itself, so I'm very glad that we did actually shift this episode from a solo episode for you, Charles, because I have learned a lot of important stuff from this.
Yeah, for some context, I originally was going to record this as a solo episode whilst Crofty was moving to Japan, but the way our timing has worked out, we decided to do it as a full episode. So, in terms of my own familiarity, I'm going to give the I'm a white European answer, which is I knew the figure from the works of Neil Gaiman and his two respective novels, American Gods, in which the figure of Mr. Nancy appears, and also his work, Anansi Boys, which features both Anansi and his children as the central characters. But yes, I must admit that outside of those particular novels, I was kind of just aware that Anansi was a folkloric, possibly mythical figure in West Africa, but I did not have a proper appreciation for how heavily both of those novels drew upon existing traditions around Anansi, particularly traditions for Anansi around the New World and in Jamaica. So that's kind of where we're both coming from for this particular episode. In terms of the material that we're going to be covering today, how we've kind of divvied this up between us is I'm going to cover Anansi and his manifestations in the Anansi Sem, or spider stories of the West African Akan peoples. I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual process of slavery and how these stories would have been transmitted to the Caribbean. And then I'm going to hand over to Crofty. You're going to talk in a bit more detail about Anansi stories that have been collected from Jamaica, and in particular the role that he played within slave society, and I believe also his influence on some other trickster figures of the region.
Yes, and a comparison of how he developed versus other African trickster figures following the abolition of slavery.
And this is something that's a little bit separate. We actually ended up writing a bit more material for this that we decided not to use for this episode because I felt it was kind of distracting from Anansi. But I think we're going to be doing some form of mini episode at some point, looking at a couple of other West African tricksters that we thought were interesting and that kind of give a bit more context to the various mythologies and folkloric traditions of the region. But that'll probably come out in a few weeks after this particular episode. So in terms of references for today's episode, I used quite a large number of sources this time. I used a couple of works by Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall of Leeds Beckett University. In particular, I used quite a lot of material from Anansi, Eshu, and Legba, Slave Resistance and the West African Trickster, and also her book, Anansi's Journey, A Story of Jamaican Cultural Resistance. In addition, I also used some sections from Robert D. Pelton's work, The Trickster in West Africa, a study of mythic irony and sacred delight. I also consulted the Akan Trickster Cycle, Myth or Folk Tale, by Professor Kweshi Yanka. I used quite a lot of material from Professor Christopher Vexay's The Exception Who Proves the Rules, Anansi the Akan Trickster. For some background information on the Ashanti people, I used some information from the introduction to State and Society in Pre-Colonial Ashanti by T.C. Mackenzie. And then for the discussions on the slave trade, I used the works Transformations in Slavery, A History of Slavery in Africa by Paul Lovejoy, and Slavery and Colonial Rule in French West Africa by Martin A. Klein. And there's also a whole bunch of extra references for me when it comes to the actual stories, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to mention those as I go.
So for my section, I did lean quite heavily on the book by Emily Zobel Marshall, Anansi's Journey, because there don't seem to be many people who have done much research into the field of Anansi stories within Jamaica. In addition, I also read through Black Culture and Black Consciousness, Afro-American Folk Thought from Slavery to Freedom by Lawrence Levine, more for an understanding of the life as a slave itself rather than the Anansi side of things, so I don't think I'll be directly referencing that, but it was very useful for background knowledge. And also The Journal of a West India Proprietor by Matthew Gregory Lewis. All of these are available on Project Gutenberg or Internet Archive.
Yeah, I will provide links in the YouTube description when this comes out on YouTube for those respective works.
Yep. For quote-unquote primary sources, where I actually got copies of the stories themselves, I read Anansi the Spider-Man, Jamaican Folk Tales by Sir Philip Manderson Sherlock, Jamaican Song and Story, Anansi Stories, Digging Songs, Ring Tunes and Dancing Tunes by Walter Jekyll, and Jamaica Anansi Stories by Martha Warren Beckwith. And I will say, primary sources might be a bit of a strong term for that, just because these are white people collecting the stories from former slaves, rather than being compiled and told by the actual Jamaicans themselves.
Yeah, I wanted to get into that actually because there's a similar problem when it comes to the Ashanti stories as well, where a lot of the time stories have been directly recorded from, say, Ashanti tellings, but all of the major collections that we have are transcribed by white Europeans, fundamentally. Some of them more studious of Ashanti Akan society than others, but that is going to be a bit of a limitation just to keep in mind for this particular episode.
Yeah.
And I will talk a little bit more about that later.
Also, in terms of academic papers, I also will be referencing Anansi, Eshu and Legba by Emily Zobel Marshall, and also her paper Nothing But Pleasant Memories of the Discipline of Slavery the Trickster and the Dynamics of Racial Representation. And I would also highly recommend a talk she gave for the Surrey Doctoral College in 2022, which is on YouTube if you search for her name.
Okay then, so should we get started?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so in order for us to understand Anansi's role kind of going forward throughout this episode, I think we really need to start out by talking a little bit about the actual history of the people who crafted these stories, along with a bit of the structure of their religion and their social organisation. So I said before that Anansi is a figure of Akan origin, and as such, I think I should talk a little bit about who the Akan peoples are. So according to Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall, the term Akan refers to an ethno-linguistic group of roughly 4 million peoples today, who are largely found in central and southern Ghana, along with parts of neighbouring Togo and the Ivory Coast, who speak a variety of mutual intelligible dialects of the Twi language. So I want to just put a quick disclaimer here. I have been so harried in terms of getting the research done for this, moving house, recording audio for a couple of guest voiceover slots, and trying to edit one of my main videos I make. I haven't been able to do the level of looking into the pronunciations that I wanted to for this, that I did for Beowulf. I have done a few, so some of my pronunciations will be correct here. I apologise deeply in advance for the ones that I'm going to get wrong. This is just a case of I ran out of time, unfortunately. So individual Akan clans include the Akuapem, the Akyem, the Bole, the Brong, the Fante, the Kwahu, the Nzima, and the Ashanti. In modern Ghana, the Ashanti in particular are a major cultural group, and indeed in the collections of Anansi stories that English-speaking scholars have compiled and rely upon, the tales largely reflect Ashanti interpretations more so than any other of the Akan groups. As such, I felt that it would also be appropriate to give you all a very brief bit of history on the Ashanti specifically. So, prior to the establishment of colonial British rule, the Ashanti people were the rulers of a dominant empire in southern and central Ghana, which largely existed from the first half of the 18th century through to the end of the 19th century. This empire grew wealthy through a combination of its military might and its highly developed trade networks throughout the region, through which it sold slaves, kola nuts, gold, and ivory to both European and West African and North African powers. After repeated attempts by the British to divide and weaken the Ashanti, which included multiple Anglo-Ashanti wars, repeated attempts to ally with the Ashanti's enemies and form alliances against them, in the 1870s, I should say we because we are British, we invaded and destroyed the Ashanti capital of Kumasi, and we proceeded to plunder its treasures. Yeah, this is going to be the British people are the villains for a lot of this episode. And yeah, it's utterly atrocious what we did. So I actually believe that some of the treasures that were plundered from Kumasi are still in the British Museum today. So this includes parts of the Ashanti gold regalia. And as of September 2022, I could not find any more recent update. These items have not been returned to Ghana despite multiple formal requests by their government. Which, quite frankly, they should be returned.
Yeah.
I mean, especially Ghana is like a thriving democracy now. The British Museum's old argument of, some of these countries are unstable and therefore these precious artifacts could be damaged, if they're returned. It's like, no, just return them. So eventually, after the conclusion of the Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War in 1901, the Ashanti Empire was forcefully converted into a colonial possession, and the Ashanti king, or Asantene, Prempeh I, was forced into exile. However, the Asantehene was eventually allowed to return to Ghana in the 1930s, and the institution of the Ashanti monarchy survived both the loss of its status as an independent kingdom and the colonial period, which finally ended in 1957. Today, the kingdom still exists as an institution in modern Ghana, though it is no longer a sovereign nation. So, to give us some understanding of Anansi's role within Ashanti society, I think it best that I give a brief outline of both wider Ashanti and Akan mythology. So, according to Professor Christopher Vexay and Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall, in Ashanti religion, the supreme deity is a being known as Nyame, or Nyankopon, who is creator, sky god, and the eldest and inexhaustible being. It is he who created and named all things, who gave order to the universe, and who has mastery over life and death. So, whilst there is a myth mentioned by Christopher Vexay that Nyame is said to have removed himself from mankind, in practice he seems to be very much an active deity, who is honoured directly through household shrines, which largely consists of a tree known as the seat of Nyame, at which offerings are placed. From reading around, it seems to be something of a controversial topic as to whether Nyame has his own direct priesthood or not, or if he is instead kind of worshipped through cults surrounding his individual aspects, which I'll get onto in a second. So beyond Nyame, there also exist numerous divinities known as the Abosom, who are generally thought to be invisible, but who reveal themselves through the forces of nature. These figures are best thought of as intermediaries between the sky god and mankind, who possess a degree of power, but ultimately that power stems from and is dependent on Nyame. So these figures include Tano the river, Asaseya the earth mother, and a malevolent entity known as Nyankopon Kweku. However, there are any number of other Abosom, and indeed it is possible for a previously unknown divinity to make itself known to the Akan at any given time. When these figures have revealed themselves to the Akan, they are each honoured with a priesthood and shrines, and are called upon for health, fertility, prosperity, and protection, amongst other needs. Alongside these divinities, Akan religion also honours their ancestor spirits, who are said to inhabit the earth alongside the living, and even to be capable of travelling between the real world and the spirit world. It is they who are said to be the true owners of all Akan land, and who are said to sustain it, promote fertility, and pass on Akan cultural values and institutions. Now, it should be noted here that by the term ancestors here, I'm not referring to any specific individuals or groups, but to the concept of ancestors simply as a whole. And it is this wider concept which functions as a powerful symbol of the Akan peoples. So I haven't really written much on this, but from what I remember of my reading, there also has been something of a historical overemphasis by European scholars on the relative weightings between these groups. So a lot more emphasis was placed on the ancestor worship aspects of Akan religion. However, more recent scholarship has concluded that whilst the ancestors are an integral part of Akan religion, Nyame is still the dominant figure. So, amongst these groups, Anansi himself is something of a difficult figure to categorise. In keeping with his ambiguous character, he has been presented as outside the hierarchy of Akan life, and there has been some debate among scholars as to whether he once functioned as a god, or an Abosom, or some other divine figure. Fittingly considering the character, the sources we have on this are quite highly contradictory. So, for example, in the 1930s, the missionary and anthropologist Joseph J. Williams would note that the Ashanti attributed the sobriquet, have I said that word correctly? Sobriquet?
I have no idea how to say that word.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It just suddenly occurred to me. I don't know. You know what? I'm going to take the coward's route out. Title. So, for example, in the 1930s, the missionary and anthropologist Joseph J. Williams would note that the Ashanti attributed the title of Supreme Being or Creator to Anansi Kokoroko, or the Great Spider. I also saw it claimed in a couple of works that this term is used as a nickname for the Supreme Deity in the much earlier 19th century work, A Dictionary of the Ashanti and Fante Language called Twi. Though when I flicked through it myself on archive.org, I couldn't find any trace of it. However, I did have some trouble understanding exactly how it was formatted, so I probably just messed up there. Reverend John S. Mabiti also claimed in his work African Religions and Philosophy from the 1960s that for the Ashanti, the spider symbolizes wisdom, and it is for this reason that the supreme being is given the name Anansi Kokroko. However, whilst there is evidence that Anansi did have some role in Ashanti mythology, and he very clearly interacts in both those and the Anansi tales with both Nyame and other divinities, outside of the claims of these scholars, there are few direct signs to be found that he was ever worshipped as a divine figure. So, for example, according to Professor Kweshi Yanka, formerly of the University of Ghana, I think he's like a government minister in Ghana now or something, in his work, the Akan Trickster Cycle, Myth and Folktale, there is no evidence of any shrines to Anansi. Unlike animals such as the elephant and some species of antelope, the spider is not the subject of religious veneration, and no sacrifices are made to him. Moreover, there is no evidence that his stories are considered myths, and according to Emily Zobel Marshall, his stories are taught in Akan schools simply as folk tales, unlike the more sacred Akan texts, which are told purely by a group of religious specialists. This is another thing that I was kind of reading around and got the impression from the historiography. I think in the past there was a lot of emphasis on the kind of more narrow-minded idea that any totemic representation of a figure within African societies must inherently be a god figure, and that may have influenced the previous understanding of Anansi as having some divine elements. So, another example of Anansi's odd position within Ashanti religion and society is found in a section of the work African Cosmos by Noel Q. King, but that I originally came across as it was related by Emily Zobel Marshall in Anansi's Journey. So between 1952 and 1962, the Oxford historian Evelyn King was tutored in Ghana by a member of the Ashanti Royal Circle named Madam Ya. During this education, Madam Ya at one point drew a diagram in the sand to explain the most important parts of Ashanti mythology, and King accordingly wrote it down. This diagram consists of Nyame at the top, along with many of his divine children, or Abasom, whilst the figures of the king and the queen mother are in the centre, represented by their thrones, or stools as they're usually referred to in Ashanti culture, and placed on the right and left-hand sides respectively. Beneath them are figures such as the primordial old woman, Aberewa, and the ancestors. So in this diagram, Anansi is not positioned with any of Nyame's divine children, as might be expected if he historically was considered a god, but is instead placed in an intermediary position on the right hand, or male side, between both the human world and the spirit world. This is a little detail I couldn't really find anywhere else to include. I think it should just be noted that in Akan culture, the line, I think, of matrilineal descent is considered more important than the male line. So, despite this ambiguous placing and disagreement between sources as to whether Anansi is considered a deity or not, we can be more certain in saying that he occupies a special place amongst the various animal protagonists that appear in Anansi folk tales. So this can be seen in how he is known as Kwaku Anansi, with Kwaku being a day name that is traditionally given to boys who are born on a Wednesday. And whilst other animals in Ashanti tales do have forenames, Anansi is the only one to be assigned a day name. So that's a marker of his special status. In order to demonstrate the various aspects of Anansi's character, I would like to turn our attention to the Anansi tales themselves. As we mentioned briefly before, overwhelmingly the English language sources we have for historical Anansi stories, or Anansi Sim, are secondary accounts that were recorded by Europeans in the early to late 20th century, rather than translations made by the Akan peoples themselves. Out of these sources, by far the most importance has been placed by the various modern scholars that I consulted on a dual language compilation in both the Ashanti dialect of Twi and English of 75 tales that was made by R.S. Rattray in the 1920s and 30s, during which time Rattray was the head of the anthropological department at Kumasi. As Rattray himself goes into detail in his preface to the tales, prior to his collection, spider stories were not actually compiled by Europeans who had taken the time to learn the Ashanti language and to go out and record these stories directly from Akan speakers. Instead, they were largely written down by African intermediaries who spoke both the Ashanti Twi dialect and English. So, the main example of this is William H. Barker and Cecilia Sinclair's 1917 collection, African Folk Tales. So I don't know about you, Crofty, but on the surface, that does actually sound to me like the best way to record and translate these stories, where they're actually primary sources by Ashanti speakers that have been translated.
Yeah.
However, as noted by Rattray, many of these stories were not directly translated into English by their original transcribers. Instead, they were just simply based on the Ashanti originals, and they omitted many of the details that have been felt by scholars to rob the stories of their original character. According to Emily Zobel Marshall, these tales read much more like European fairy tales and often ended on a moralizing theme that is usually absent from many of the original stories. The coarseness that marks many Anansi stories was also at times expunged, which was possibly because their transcribers had often been taught English at missionary schools. So it kind of makes sense that some particularly offending passages and stories have been ignored. In addition, these stories were not specifically limited to those collected by the Ashanti, and it's kind of just generally difficult to figure out which group of peoples they were collected from and under what circumstances as well. By comparison, Rattray claims in the preface to his work to have recorded his stories word for word verbatim from evening storytellings by village elders. So after each of the tellings, the best storyteller would be judged by all present, and Rattray would record their telling. It's for this reason that English-speaking scholars do largely rely on the stories he recorded. However, for anyone else interested, there are a few other second-hand resources for Akan Anansi stories. So this includes the works of M.J. and F.S. Herskovits, the works of Professor Eva L. Meyerowitz, and a number of story summaries provided by both Kweshi Yanka and Robert B. Pelton in their respective works. I will say, a lot of the European scholars who have written in-depth works on Anansi are very aware of the kind of disengagement that reading the stories purely in English kind of has from Ashanti society. I think both Robert Pelton and Emily Zobel Marshall, I think, kind of had sections in their respective works saying it's kind of difficult to get the true feel of these stories when you're a European reading them in English in a European country. You kind of struggle to get the same context in terms of the environments that these tales are talking about.
Yeah, that's very much a thing that will come up in my section as well.
Yeah. Rattray also gives us some useful information on how Anansi storytellings were actually conducted. So, Anansi stories are told only at night or at ceremonial occasions. Anyone is allowed to tell an Anansi story, and before each telling, the narrator typically begins by using the formulaic opening phrase, Yense se, nse seo, which I've just butchered there and I apologise, which roughly means, we don't really mean it, that what we are going to say is true. After a story is completed, they typically end with the phrase, this, my story, which I've related, if it be sweet, or if it be not sweet, take some elsewhere, and let some come back to me. It should also be noted that just because a tale is named an Anansi sim, it does not mean that it actually involves Anansi in any capacity, as by definition all Ashanti tales of this type are called spider stories. And there is even an Anansi tale which explains how this came to be, which I will now read, the appropriately named title of How It Came About That the Sky God Stories Came to Be Known as Spider Stories. I do actually want to note as well, I am guilty of summarising some of these stories for length myself. So once Kwaku Anansi, the spider, went to visit the supreme god, Nyame, in order to buy his stories. After the spider informs Nyame that he would like to purchase them, the sky god says, "Great and powerful towns like Kokofu, Bekwai, and Asumenja have come, but they are unable to purchase them, and you who are but a mere masterless man, you say you will be able." Anansi then asks Nyame what the price will be, and Nyame replies that the stories can be bought in exchange for the following creatures: Unini the python, Osibo the leopard, Mumoesha the fairy, and Mumoboro the hornets. Anansi agrees to the price, stating that he will throw in his mother Nisia as well, and departs to inform both her and his wife Aso of his deal. Anansi then asks Aso how he is to catch the python, to which he replies that he should cut a branch off a palm tree along with some string creeper. After he has done so, Aso tells him to take these items to the stream. On his way, Anansi begins an imaginary conversation with himself, saying, "It's longer than he is, it's not so long as he. You lie, it's longer than he. There he is, lying yonder." Unini overhears this imaginary conversation and asks Anansi, "What's it all about?" The spider says, "It is not my wife Aso, who is arguing with me that this palm branch is longer than you, and I say she is a liar." So in order to help prove her wrong, the python bids Anansi to measure the branch against his body, and after Anansi asks Python to stretch himself out, the spider ties him up with a rope creeper, making the sound of Nuenene. Anansi then mocks his foolishness and takes him off to Nyame and returns to Aso and asks her what to do about the hornets. She bids him to take a gourd and half fill it with water and then go off with it. Anansi takes the gourd into the bush and spies a hanging swarm of hornets. First, he sprinkles some of the gourd water on the hornets, then he pours the remainder on himself and covers himself with a leaf of a plantain. He says to the hornets, "As the rain has come, had you not better come and enter this, my gourd, so that the rain will not beat you? Don't you see that I have taken a plantain leaf to cover myself?" The hornets then say, "We thank you, Aku, we thank you, Aku," and fly inside the gourd. Anansi covers the entrance, mocks them again for being fools, and takes them off to Nyame. Returning to Aso, he again asks her how to capture the leopard or Sibo, to which she simply replies, "Go dig a hole." Understanding what she meant, the spider runs off and finds the leopard's tracks, then digs a great hole and covers it over. When things begin to become visible, which is usually the device in these stories for when dawn arrives, the next day he returns to the hole and discovers a leopard lying within. Anansi says to him, "Little father's child, little mother's child, I have told you not to get drunk, and now, just as one would expect of you, you have become intoxicated, and that's why you've fallen in the pit. If I were to say I would get you out next day, if you saw me, or likewise any of my children, you would go and catch them." The leopard said, "Oh, I could do no such thing." So Anansi goes and gets 2 sticks and, quote, places one here and one there. He said to the leopard to put his paws on the sticks, and as the Sibo is about to climb out, Anansi lifts up his hidden knife and stabs him in the head. The spider then gets a ladder, retrieves the leopard's body, and delivers him to Nyame. For his final act, he forgoes asking his wife for help this time, and in order to capture a fairy, he carves what's called an Akua's child, which is a black, flat-faced wooden doll, and coats it in sticky latex. He then mashes some yams, places them in its hand and in a brass basin in front of it, and ties a string around the doll's waist. Anansi then takes the doll and the basin and places them at the bottom of an odum tree, which is a place where fairies are said to play. After a while, a fairy comes along and asks the doll if it may eat a little of the mash. Anansi pulls the string around the doll's waist, which results in its head nodding, and the fairy eats the mash. She thanks the doll, but it does not answer, so the fairy tells her sister to slap the doll's crying place, so her face. The fairy does so, only for her hand to get stuck fast. She asks her sister for advice again, and she tells her again to slap it with her free hand. She does so, and finding both of her hands stuck fast, she asks her sister for help once again. Her sister, rather unhelpfully, tells her to push the doll with her stomach, which she again does, leaving her stuck completely fast. Anansi then comes along and ties her up, calling her a fool as he did the others, and takes her off to the sky god along with his mother. Nyame then summons his elders and all of his retinue, and tells them that, quote, "Very great kings have come, and were not able to buy the sky god's stories, but Kwaku Anansi, the spider, has been able to pay the price. I have received from him Mumoboro, the hornets. I have received from him Mumoesha, the fairy. I have received from him Osibo, the leopard. I have received from him Onini, the python. And of his own accord, Anansi has added his mother to the lot. All these things lie here." The court then shouts his praises, and the sky god decrees that from today and going on forever, the sky god's stories shall be known as Anansi's. And that is why they are all called spider stories and relate Anansi's deeds instead of Nyame's. And as with all spider stories, it ends with the words, "This is my story which I have related. If it be sweet, or if it be not sweet, take some elsewhere, and let some come back to me." So, on a little side note here, if anyone out there is familiar with the figure of Brer Rabbit, or Brer Rabbit, as I've heard it said sometimes, I believe it's Brer Rabbit because it's a contraction of brother. That may sound like a very infamous story associated with that particular character, and I don't think you're going into this individual story, Crofty, but this sort of thing will come up when we come to Anansi in the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, I won't be telling the Brer Rabbit stories in detail. That's something for another time.
Yes, I think we agreed during the course of this research that Brer Rabbit is has a very complex social role attached to his folklore. So I think we will have to do a full episode at some point on that and have to be very careful in how we discuss it.
Yeah.
So, in terms of his physical attributes in these stories, Anansi is shown to be a shapeshifter. In some stories, he is seen to very much have the form of a man, whereas in others he is described as having the bald head and the bulbous lower body of a spider, and indeed being able to perform typical spider tricks such as sitting on the ceiling and running on the surface of water. And in some tales he is described as having a mixture of the two traits simultaneously. Now, interestingly, some of his more spider-like traits actually have stories that explain their origins. So, for example, in the story of how the spider got his bald head, we are told that whilst pretending to be ritually fasting after the death of his mother-in-law, Anansi tries to avoid being caught eating beans by hiding them in his hat. However, the beans burn his head, and this has left him bald ever since. Similarly, in the story of how it came about that the hinder part of Kwaku Anansi, the spider, became big at the expense of his head, which became small, he receives his bulbous lower body after ignoring the warning of a spirit, which causes his head to become detached from his body. Anansi then clamps his head onto his anus, resulting in his characteristic spider shape. So outside of these physical traits, Anansi is also possessed of a strong sexuality, and is seen in the course of his stories to have multiple wives, the primary of whom is the aforementioned Aso. So interestingly, whilst Akan society is a matrilineal one, according to Emily Zobel Marshall's book, generally women play a subservient role to men within Akan society. Aso's relationship with Anansi is very much in line with this. However, in some stories, she is shown to be more intelligent than him, as we saw in the previous story of how he acquired the Sky God's stories. A number of Anansi Sem also see him attempting to acquire new wives, either through trade, seduction, or even theft. On a few occasions these efforts are successful, but equally it is possible for these pursuits to go awry, and often this is caused through his own arrogance. An example of this is to be found in the story of the Sky God's daughter, which is related in The King's Drum, which is a collection of African folk stories compiled by Harold Corlander in the 1960s, with the tale itself being originally narrated by an Ashanti man named Albert Kofi Prempeh. So it is said that Nyame had a daughter whom men wished to marry. However, her father turned away all suitors and refused to discuss the matter. One day there was a big festival in the town, and after the people and Nyame danced, the sky god had his golden stool brought out and he sat upon it. He then decreed that the first man to discover his daughter's secret name would become his son-in-law. However, no man present knew her name, and Nyame sent away all of the suitors. Now it just so happened Anansi was at the festival, and he wished to wed Nyame's daughter. He went to the garden where the daughter walked each evening and hid in a mango tree. After a while she came along with a servant, and each time a mango fell from the tree where Anansi was hiding, the servant said, "O Badua se man pensa, another mango has fallen." After they left, Anansi came down from his hiding place and ran home singing her name to himself so that he would not forget it. He then took his talking drum and started practicing playing Badue se man pensa over and over. However, he was unable to keep the secret to himself, so he went to his friend Lizard and told him the name, then asked him to come with him to Nyame. So the next day, Anansi sends a messenger to tell of his arrival, and he and Lizard set off to the Sky God's house. There he tries to tell Nyame and the rest of the town of his daughter's secret name, but he insists on playing it on his drums. So, I think I'll go into this later. In Akan mythology, Nyame usually communicates using drums. So Anansi is very much appropriating this privilege in a particularly arrogant way. However, he does not play the drums well, and Nyame does not recognize the name. So eventually Anansi turns to Lizard and says, "Tell the people what the drum says. They are very stupid." Lizard then says, "The girl's name is Badua Seman Pensa." The sky god then claps his hands in joy, the townsfolk cheer, and the hand of Nyame's daughter is given to Lizard. Thus, through Anansi's own arrogance in usurping Nyame's privilege of drum talking, he undoes his marital plans. So in addition to his wives, in some tales Anansi is also seen to have 4 children, Nitikuma, Nankon Fwe, which I believe means fin shanks, Afudu Chwe Do Twe, which is belly like to burst, and Tiko no Kono, or big big head. These figures each have their own roles within Anansi's stories, occasionally managing to thwart their father's schemes, to which he often reacts with cruel punishments. As we're going to see going on as well, being a family member or a friend of Anansi doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things. He's going to behave to you exactly the same way he would to anyone else. So a good example of the cruel punishments that Anansi occasionally inflicts on his children and family can be found in the somewhat grim story of how it came about that children were first whipped. To summarise this tale, one day whilst out in the bush, Anansi found a miraculous dish named "Fill Me Up and Eat" that would fill up with palm oil soup whenever it was commanded. Anansi takes it home with him and hides it on the ceiling behind his hut. For the next few days, he refuses to accept any food from his wife, instead secretly sneaking off and eating the soup of the dish. However, his son Nitikuma soon realizes that his father is not growing thin, and one day, whilst Anansi is in the bush, he discovers the dish. He gathers his brothers and mother to see it, and after Nitikuma asks the bull what it taboos, it replies, "I hate a gunwad and a small gourd cup." Nitikuma and Belly Like to Burst then go and find these items, and they touch them to the bull. Later, Anansi comes back, and he tries to pull his same trick with the dish, but to his anger, it no longer works. Anansi quickly realizes that Nitikuma is behind this, and in a fit of rage, he smashes the no longer working dish. The next day out in the bush, Anansi comes across another strange item where he found the dish before, and asks it what it is. It replies that it is called Swish and Raise Wheels. And after Anansi asks it to demonstrate its swishing, it falls upon him and beats him mercilessly. A nearby bird tells him a command that will get it to stop, and Anansi then takes the whip back home and hides it in the same place as the dish. He then pulls the same trick of refusing to eat when offered food, and climbs upon the ceiling, only this time he stealthily climbs back down and hides out of sight. Nitakuma tells his mother and siblings that their father has brought something again, and they climb up to get a look. Nitakuma asks the item its name, and when it replies, he asks it to demonstrate its swishing. As with Anansi, it then falls upon the group and beats them mercilessly. When his family are all soundly thrashed, Anansi then speaks the command for it to stop, after which he splits the whip up into many pieces and scatters them around. And it is through this that the whip came to the people. So I also came across a few different variants of this story. Probably the most notable variation is that in some versions, these events take place during a famine, and rather than Anansi refusing food from his family, what he's actually doing is using the magic dish to gorge himself whilst leaving his family to starve. So their complaints are a little bit more justified. So, as we discussed in our opening summary, within these stories themselves, Anansi usually acts as a disruptive force who breaks many of the norms of Akan society and who relates to both the human world and the spirit world in a number of contradictory ways. Perhaps most striking of his relationships is that with the supreme being, Nyame, with whom he is related by blood and who he is continually seen to undermine and yet still attempt to draw himself into closer alliance with. So we saw, for example, earlier where he attempts to wed Nyame's daughter. In this, he is a somewhat unique figure. He's the only one that I'm aware of within Akan tales and wider mythology that is able to challenge the Sky God in this manner, and is also the only one who is capable of fooling him. However, despite the two figures being related, Anansi lacks Nyame's veneration, and he is often seen to be trying to claim his privileges for himself. So a good example of this is in a number of Ashanti tales collected by MJ and FS Herkovitz in the 1930s that I mentioned before, where Anansi petitions Nyame to become his messenger. However, upon landing the role, Anansi immediately begins to distort the contents of these messengers for his own means, and even to threaten other people with Nyame's power. So, for example, in one tale, he is sent to give a riddle message to Nyame's 3 children, who are Darkness, Moon, and Dawn, with the intent that the one who gives the correct answer should be made Nyame's heir or headman. However, Anansi promptly gives the game away by telling Dawn the answer, who just so ever happens to be the one child of the 3 who actually fed him. In this role, he also attempts to appropriate Nyame's various privileges, as I mentioned before, such as communicating via drums. Outside of Nyame, he is happy to disrespect and manipulate the Abosom, though occasionally these attempts do backfire. For example, in the story of Kwaku Anansi and the Rainmaker, which comes from Peggy Apaya's work Anansi the Spider, Tales from an Ashanti Village, Anansi is friends with a farmer named Kwaku Sini. During a drought, Kwaku Sini asks Nyame for help, and Nyame tells him to find the hunchback Eshu, who is the Abosom to whom he has delegated the task of rainmaking. On finding Eshu in a clearing, he politely asks if he may beat the hunchback's back in order to receive rain, and after gaining his permission, he does so using a small set of drumsticks. When he gets back to his farm, he finds that there has been a heavy downpour and that it was well watered. Now, on his way past Kwaku Sini's farm, Anansi sees this and rejoices, expecting that his own farm will also have been watered by the downpour. When he gets home, however, he sees that this is not the case, and he asks his friend what has happened. Kwaku Sini tells him of Eshu, and Anansi thanks him and seeks out the Abosom for himself. Instead of drumsticks, however, he takes with him 2 large clubs, hoping to gain more rain and to grow better crops. By the time he reaches the clearing, Eshu is already on his way home, so he hurries up and he beats Eshu's back with his clubs, not stopping until the hunchback is dead. Rather than showing any great grief at what he has done, Anansi thinks only of what this could mean for himself, and proceeds to hide the body in a mango tree. After this, he goes and finds Kwaku Sini, and frames him for the murder by making him think he has knocked Eshu out of the tree. These actions backfire, however, as Kwaku Sini outsmarts Anansi by pretending that he has met with one of Nyame's messengers, who told him that the sky god was sick of Eshu anyway and had put a bounty on his head. Anansi then admits to the murder, and when Nyame hears of this, he punishes Anansi by preventing any water from ever falling on his farm again. And we are told that it remains a desert to this day. So, see what I mean about being Anansi's friend? It does not mean that you're not also going to be a victim of his wrath. So, according to Christopher Vexay, Anansi also has similar escapades where he is punished for ignoring the orders of the Old Woman of the Earth by being afflicted by sores, is physically deformed after disobeying a river Abosom, and on 2 occasions he is even killed in his stories by other Abosom after either trying to trick them or ignoring their orders. In line with his contradictory characterization, however, he is at other times shown to be untouchable by death, who in one tale he tricks into giving up riches, and then promptly escapes from the underworld. In doing so, he is again seen to defy Nyame, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the master over life and death. So in terms of his relationship with the human world, Anansi has a similarly conflicted relationship. According to Christopher Vexay, in some myths he is thought of as an ancestral figure, who in many ways is the spiritual father of all people. And indeed in some myths he is even said to have created mankind's physical form, though it is still Nyame that ultimately gave man life. He is also said to be the originator of language, and the design for the spider is accordingly to be found on the staffs of Akan royal spokesmen and linguists. There are also a number of occasions where, through his disruptive behaviours, he accidentally introduces more positive qualities into the world, or even inadvertently manages to bring about an important norm of Ashanti society. So, the best example I have of this is one of the more popular Anansi stories, versions of which were related by most of the scholars I consulted in their works. It is the story of how it came about that wisdom came amongst the tribe, and it is in fact short enough that I can read R.S. Ratray's English translation in full, which might give it a bit more of a feel for the language. They said that Kwaku Anansi, the spider, was there, and that he swept up all knowledge, gathered it in one spot, and placed it in a gourd pot. He then declared that he would climb a tree and go hang it on it, so that all wisdom on earth would be finished. So he took it up to go with it, and when he reached beneath the tree where he was going to hang it, he took a string and tied it to the gourd and hung it in front of him, and he set himself to climb the tree. He climbed and climbed and climbed, in vain. He strove again he made to climb, and climb, in vain. Now his son, Nitikuma, who was standing by, said, "Oh, your eyes have surely died for shame. Would it not have been better if you had turned around the gourd and put it on your back? Then doubtless you would have been able to climb." The spider said, "Clear out, you and your old-fashioned sayings." Then he took the climb once more as before, but once again fruitlessly. Then he considered long, and finally took the gourd and put it behind him. Then he set himself to climb, and mounted swiftly. Kra, kra, kra was the sound of his climbing. There he goes. He reached where the branches began to spread out from the stem, and said to himself, "I Kwaku Anansi, by the lesser god Afio, I might as well be dead. My child who is so small, so small, so small, there was I collected all wisdom, so I thought, in one place, yet some remained which even I did not perceive, and lo, my child, this still sucking infant, has shown it to me." Then he seized the gourd, and there was the sound of rending, tintini, and he cast it away, and there was the sound of scattering, tise. So it's a very onomatopoeic language. That is how everyone got wisdom, and anyone who did not go there in time to pick some up is, excusing my saying so, a fool. This, my story, which I've related, if it be sweet, or if it be not sweet, take some elsewhere, and let some come back to me. So I might have made that sound like a kind of a more whimsical take on the story, in terms of Anansi realizing that he has actually failed to collect all the wisdom in the world. But the interpretations that I saw from most of the scholars that wrote about this story, they actually interpret it as having more of a petulant edge to it. So it's not a case of Anansi going, oh, my child is a lot smarter than I thought, and maybe I'm not as wise as I thought. It's more a case of Anansi going, yeah, how awful it is that I have not managed to collect all the wisdom. I'm going to throw this pot on the floor. is the vibe that I think a lot of interpretations had. And it would be more keeping with the characterization of Anansi in the various other stories as well. So, on the flip side to him occasionally bringing these more positive qualities into the world, he is also said to be the figure who first made death and disease come into the world, who brought the concept of debt to the Akan people, and through whose actions some negative qualities and cruel implements came to the Ashanti, so as we saw with the whip before. Moreover, his actual interactions with people in many of these tales are marked by trickery, deceit, and cruelty, whether they be with men, women, or the other animals of the Anansi Sem, and he is happy to lie, cheat, steal, and even commit murder to advance his own interests. On the rare occasions that he is seen to help a particular village or group of people, it is usually in the expectation of payment, or even to thwart a danger that he has secretly engineered himself to gain the people's gratitude. Conversely, the people of these stories are usually well aware that Anansi is a liar, to the point of refusing to believe any of the actual genuinely altruistic acts that he performs. As an example of these negative interactions, I would like to relate the story of how Anansi the Spider became poor, again taken from R.S. Rattray's collection. So one day, Kwaku Anansi went to the sky god Nyame and said, "Give me a grain of corn and let me bring you a whole village in exchange." Nyame calls him a liar, and Anansi swears on his mother Nasia that he will pay with his head should he fail. After receiving the grain, he goes off to a certain village and tells the headman that Nyame has ordered him to let the grain sleep with the fowls. The headman is dubious, but he allows it, and the next day the grain is nowhere to be found. Anansi tells the headman that the fowls have eaten it, and unable to dispute this, the headman gives him a bird to smooth things over. Anansi then takes the fowl to another village, where he tells the headman that Nyame has ordered him to let it sleep with the sheep. The headman allows it, and that night Anansi sneaks back into the sheep kraal and kills the fowl, then sticks its intestines on a ram's horn. The next day he tells the headman that the ram has killed the sky god's fowl, and the headman gives him a sheep to smooth things over. Anansi then continues to another village, and this cycle continues over and over, the spider incriminating the villagers in the death of the thing he brought and exchanging it for something else. In this fashion, he trades the sheep for a cow, the cow for the corpse of a young slave, and then he uses this to fool another village into thinking they have killed Nyame's favourite child. After this, he convinces its peoples to go before Nyame with him. He sends a messenger ahead, Nyame and his assembly sit down to greet them, and Anansi then enters, singing of all the trades he made. He tells the sky god that he has brought a whole town to make good on his promise, and Nyame calls on his assembly to praise him. In some versions of this tale, the reason why Anansi is doing all this is in return for wealth from Nyame. In Rattray's version of the story, after this has happened, Nyame then asks Anansi what reward he would ask for, and Anansi replies, "I do not desire anything, a place on the rafters is all I want," which is kind of interpreted as this show of false humility. In response, the sky god rewards him with lifelong poverty. So, he got his just desserts there. Ultimately, we can see through Anansi's relationships with the rest of the world that he is capable of breaking social rules, on some occasions with impunity, regardless of whether the person he is contending with is a mere human or the supreme deity himself. Perhaps the only truly concrete thing that can be said about this contradictory figure is that regardless of the circumstances, he can almost always be counted on to be driven by his self-interest, and fundamentally, if anyone is foolish enough to reward or help him, there is a good chance that he will immediately break their trust and take everything that they have. However, he is not entirely immune to consequences for his actions, and often his disruptive deeds are kept in check by Nyame, the Abosom, and the other animal figures. So, going beyond the actual contents of the Anansi Sim, it has also been argued that these stories played something of a political role within Ashanti society, which was to act as a popular form of veiled complaint regarding political leaders and rulers. So it's thought that that kind of explains the opening refrain at the beginning of stories, where it's to kind of deflect blame for any allusion to political figures. So, for example, Dr. Emily Zobel Marsh notes in her works that because spider tales portrayed a world where societal norms could be upended, they provided an important role in allowing the tellers to temporarily escape the strict hierarchy of Ashanti society. Indeed, within these tales, even the most powerful figures of the Ashanti world can be the butt of the story, including the high god Nyame on occasion. From what I read, it seems that these storytellings as complaint are considered more of a psychological act rather than as an act of rebellion, with them being designed to help the community accept the rules of their society and religion. Again, this is all very much in line with Anansi's role of testing cultural boundaries by bending or breaking them, only to ultimately reaffirm them through his actions or through the responses of others. To round off my discussion of Anansi in West Africa, I want to share one final story. This story caught my eye because, to my mind, it combines almost all the major aspects of Anansi's character. So this includes his guile and his trickery, his cruelty and violence, his important role of bringing the world into its current order by fomenting disorder, and even a small element of his lewdness and occasional sexual boasting. This is the story of how contradiction came amongst the tribe. So once there was a man named Hate to be Contradicted, who because of that went and built a small settlement by himself. One day he was visited by the Dyker, which is a type of small wood antelope that's native to sub-Saharan Africa, and the two went and sat at the foot of a palm tree. Some of its nuts fell down, and the antelope said, "Father, Hate to be Contradicted, your palm nuts are ripe." Hate to be Contradicted said, "That is the nature of the palm nut," and tells the Dyker that when the tree ripens, 3 branches ripen all at once, then he cuts them down, boils them to make tree water pots full of oil, and then he takes them to Akase to buy an old woman. The woman then comes and gives birth to Hate to be Contradicted's grandmother, who then gives birth to his mother, and finally to him, but when she bears him, he is already standing there. The Dyker is understandably skeptical and says, "As for all that, you lie." Angered, Hate to be Contradicted takes a stick and strikes it over the head and kills it. So in time, Hate to be Contradicted was visited again by an Abide antelope, and after that they go and sit under the palm tree, and the exact same sequence of events plays out, as it does every time that an animal comes to visit. Kwaku Anansi the Spider notices this, and he goes and fetches his bag and cloth, and goes to Hate to be Contradicted's village. Hate to be Contradicted orders food to be made for his guest, and the two of them sit together under the palm tree. As the palm nuts fall, Anansi at first says nothing, but instead gathers them up until his bag is full. After he has eaten the food, he finally says, "Father, Hate to be Contradicted, your palm nuts are ripe." And Hate to be Contradicted recounts his story from before. Anansi then says, "You do not lie, what you say is true. As for me, I have some okros standing in my farm, and when they are ripe, I join 77 long hooked poles to reach them to pull them down. But even then they do not reach, so I lie on my back and am able to use my penis to pluck them." Hate to be Contradicted says that he understands, and promises to visit to see this the next day. On the way home, Anansi chews up the palm nuts and spits them out on the path. On arriving home, he tells his children that Hate to be Contradicted will arrive tomorrow, and that when the man arrives, they shall tell him that Anansi has broken his penis in 7 places, which takes quite some doing. I'm going to stop now, and has taken it to the blacksmith to be mended. The next day, when things begin to be visible, Hate to be Contradicted sets off for the spider's village. Here the children tell him that Anansi has gone to the blacksmith about his penis, and ask if he saw the blood on the path, so the chewed up palm nuts. Hate to be Contradicted replies that he did indeed see it, and asks where their mother is. Anansi's child then tells him that yesterday their mother dropped a water pot in the stream, but thankfully was able to catch it. However, she didn't complete catching it, so she's gone back today to finish the job. Hate to be Contradicted says nothing at this, and after Anansi arrives, he orders food to be cooked. The children make soup, but they deliberately fill it with peppers so it is too hot, and after eating it, Hate to be Contradicted is so pained that he wanted to die. He tells Nitikuma to draw water for him so he may drink, but whilst he sees Nitikuma go off to the watering place, he does not bring any water back with him. When Hate to be Contradicted asks him where the water is, Nitikuma replies that the water they have is of 3 different levels. The top belongs to his father, the middle to his mother's co-wife, and the bottom to his mother. Thus he says that he must take care to draw only water from the bottom, or else he will cause a family dispute. Hate to be Contradicted finally snaps and says, "You brat, you lie." Straight away Anansi says, "Beat him so that he dies." When Hate to be Contradicted asks why this should be, Anansi says, "You say you hate to be contradicted, and yet you have contradicted someone. That is why I must beat you so that you may die." Anansi then cuts up his body into little pieces and scatters it about. That is why now there are so many peoples who hate to be contradicted to be found in the tribe. This is my story, which I have related. If it be sweet, or if it be not sweet, take some elsewhere and let some come back to me. With that, I have now come to the end of my discussion on Anansi in Africa. So we must now turn our attention to Anansi stories outside of Africa, specifically to those found in the Caribbean. As we mentioned before, Crofty, you're going to be discussing these in detail. However, I felt that before they do that, it would be proper for us to outline exactly how they reached this region. Between the 16th and the 19th century, Anansi's stories were transmitted to the Caribbean, particularly to the island of Jamaica, through the transport of West African slaves during the course of the transatlantic slave trade. This generally refers to a period between approximately 1501 and the late 19th century, when European powers such as Great Britain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, and to a smaller extent Spain, Denmark, and Sweden forcefully transported large numbers of African slaves to the New World, where their labour was economically exploited. These slaves were mostly purchased from coastal African kingdoms through trading posts established by the Europeans. This pattern allowed them to limit their exposure to more interior tropical diseases such as malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery, against which they had very little immunity. Initially, this trade was dominated by the Portuguese, who mostly shipped slaves to what is now Brazil. But over the course of the 17th and the 18th century, the increasing demand for sugar in countries such as France, and particularly Britain, led to them purchasing huge numbers of slaves to work in sugar plantations in North America and the Caribbean. It is important to note that many African kingdoms did have pre-existing forms of slavery that were often based more around kinship and pawnage practices rather than the more severe variant of European slavery. However, the vast European demand for slaves greatly increased the scope and violence of these systems. The result was that many African nations became economically incentivized to conduct frequent raids and low-level wars against their neighbors, with the captives being sold on to European slavers on the coast. So, for example, one power that kind of gained prominence as a result of this practice was the Fong Kingdom of Dahomey, and what is now southern Benin, which acted as a major slave supplier and conducted many slave raids on Yoruba areas, which may have led to the transmission of other trickster figures that we're probably going to talk about in the mini-episode I mentioned, to areas such as Haiti. In later centuries of the trade, many European nations also exploit and exacerbate these local wars between African kingdoms by selling them large amounts of gunpowder and weaponry. So this whole process kind of resulted in what's known as the Triple Passage, where you would have goods from, say, the United Kingdom and Europe brought down to West Africa, then taken over the Atlantic to North America, and then brought back over to Europe. And from what I remember, the second kind of passage over the Atlantic to North America was the worst phase, which had the highest mortality for slaves.
A 30% mortality rate.
Yes, thank you for that. The exact number of people who were enslaved and forcibly transported over the Atlantic is a controversial and much disputed topic, but it should just be said that all the estimates I found are staggering in their horror. According to the Slave Voyages database, it is thought that around 12.5 million people were enslaved and transported to the Western Hemisphere between 1501 and 1875. It should be noted that this figure is based largely on surviving shipping manifests, so it may be an underestimate. So, Crofty, you might be able to help me out here. I couldn't find any specific figures for how many slaves were transported to Jamaica by first the Spanish and then later the British. What I did find is that between 1626 and 1825, some 2.6 million people were transported by the British from the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, and the Slave Coast to the Caribbean.
Yeah, the figure from the US, from the Jamaican embassy in America, gives roughly 2 million people since Jamaica.
And here they were predominantly employed in brutal plantation labour. However, as you mentioned with the mortality rate beforehand, Crofty, many of these enslaved people did not actually live to reach this region. It's estimated that roughly 1.8 million enslaved people died during the course of transportation over the Atlantic due to a combination of European disease and the horrific conditions on board slave ships. Finally, as I noted in my old Mountains of Kong video, which I do need to get around to doing a second part at some point, as that second part will quite heavily talk about the slave trade, millions of slaves are also thought to have died in the seasoning camps of the Americas, whilst millions more people likely perished during slave-taking wars and raids within Africa itself. So, yeah, it's just kind of staggering when you actually sit down and look into this, because I think I'm right in saying, Crofty, a lot of people in Britain, as far as I'm aware, it is now taught a lot more in schools, but for a certain generation of people, the slave trade, I think, is just this kind of empty, just indefined bad period of British history that is kind of de-emphasized and is not given the due attention that it deserves.
Yeah, when I learnt about it, the focus was very much on what America did, not what Britain did, which really shouldn't have done it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to Britain and Portugal are like the worst two in terms of the slave trade. And it's like, it's one of those where it's like, you know, obviously both sides killed millions effectively. So it's you know, to move back onto our actual topic for today's episode, I will hand over to you now to talk about the legacy of Anansi on slave plantations in Jamaica.
Thank you. So, during the Spanish occupation of Jamaica, between 1498 and 1655, the majority of slaves brought to Jamaica were of Akan Ashanti origin. This would then continue into the British occupation of Jamaica from the 1670s onwards, even as the Ashanti put up resistance to the British in Africa. We don't have exact numbers of how many Ashanti people versus other tribes were brought to Jamaica, but the Ashanti people were the most sought after of people for slave buyers in Jamaica. They were considered to be the strongest and hardiest tribe in Western Africa, as well as being renowned for their strength because of the strong social structure and their ability to organise that was observed by the British. That trait was also seen as useful for workers. This strong social structure and the bonds formed through the shared oral tradition that they had did help them to retain many aspects of their culture, even as they adapted to life in the New World. And in this very harsh environment of oppression, labour and violence, and survival at all costs, Anansi would evolve to take on a new role. So the Trickster, who was previously known for testing social boundaries and rules, would become in many ways a resistance fighter. Phrasing it like that might sound a bit dramatic, and might give you expectations that don't really match the reality of the stories, or match our perceptions of the stories when you hear them. I don't mean to imply that Anansi turned into Luke Skywalker. His resistance was a much more subtle form of resistance. And in fact, to me, working on my notes as a white person living quite a privileged 21st century life, putting these stories between descriptions of life on a Jamaican plantation does seem quite jarring. To you, Charles, and to many of our listeners, I imagine it might seem the same. You might not immediately connect what seems like a whimsical folk tale to an idea of resistance against slavers. And that is an important part of their effectiveness. Many slave owners or plantation employees who would be overseeing the slaves dismissed these stories as entertainment for children. And in fact, a lot of slave owners would have the nurses be telling Anansi stories to their own children, not realizing the content there. Because in these stories of a spider playing tricks on other animals, there were lessons on how to survive and how to strike back at your oppressors when you were the weakest creature in a hierarchy. As well as by maintaining the spirit of resistance was also very important to the psychological welfare of the slaves, and so helped them maintain their individuality and their own culture in this oppressed environment. In the stories themselves, the most obvious change, once they've been transported to Jamaica, is the loss of most of their supernatural element. Before, as you described, Charles, Anansi very much occupied the boundaries between the mortal world and the world of the gods. However, the concept of this supernatural world didn't survive the crossing to Jamaica. The world of Nyame was of course strongly linked to the environment of West Africa, to the jungles of the Akan regions, and the boundaries between the human settlements and the wild lands beyond them. So by ripping the people from this environment and transferring them to a country that is growing towns and cultivated plantation land, and so a lot of large swaths of land have been tamed by human efforts, the concept of this supernatural world was quite soon lost. However, Anansi, being known for crossing the boundaries between the human and the spirit world, was one of the few African elements of the Ashanti stories that could survive in Jamaica. So instead of the sky god Nyame as the most powerful being within the stories, Anansi stories in Jamaica would tend to pit Anansi against a tiger, also known as Brother Tiger or Brer Tiger. In the hierarchy of the animals, Tiger was generally considered the most powerful of all the creatures, while Anansi was considered the least powerful. So this hierarchy sets up a somewhat different power dynamic than Anansi and the Sky God, and the story From Tiger to Anansi really establishes this power dynamic. This story is a variant of the story of how the Sky God's stories became known as Anansi stories, and so you will recognise certain elements that you heard in Charles's version. The story begins with all the animals in the forest sat in a circle in the evening talking. The snake asks, "Who is the strongest of us all?" To which the dog replies, "Tiger is strongest. When Tiger whispers, trees listen. When Tiger is angry and cries out, the trees tremble." Snake then asks, "Who is the weakest?" To which dog responds, "Anansi," getting a laugh from the group. Anansi the Spider is weakest of all. When he whispers, no one listens. When he shouts, everyone laughs. When Tiger and Anansi met, Tiger did not greet Anansi. Anansi, bowing before Tiger, begged a favour. He said that Tiger puts his name to many things, tiger lilies, tiger stories, tiger moths, and many others, and Anansi has nothing to his name. He asked Tiger if the stories could instead be named Anansi stories. Tiger, wanting to keep the stories for himself, decided to trick Anansi and humiliate him, and he said that he would give Anansi the stories on one condition, that Anansi capture the snake and bring him to Tiger alive. He gave Anansi 1 week to do this. When Anansi agreed, all the animals who were listening laughed. During the week, Anansi attempted to lay several traps for Snake, including a noose trap and a pit trap, but all of these failed as Snake was too long and slippery to be caught. On Saturday, the last day, Anansi had a different idea. He walked past the hole where Snake lived, and Snake, who was poking his head out, called out to Anansi and told him how angry he was at Anansi's attempts to capture him. Anansi apologised and said that it was only because he wanted to prove that Snake was the longest animal in the world, longer than the bamboo tree. Snake insisted that he was, crawling out of his hole to show Anansi. But Anansi insisted that the tree was too far away, and went to cut it down so he could lay it next to Snake. Next, when Snake lay down next to the tree, Anansi said, "When I go up to see where your head is, you will crawl up, and when I go down to see where your tail is, you will crawl down. In that way, you will always seem longer than the bamboo tree, when really it is longer than you are." Snake, who would not let Anansi deny that he was longer than the tree, told Anansi to tie his tail to the end of the bamboo. Anansi did so, before encouraging Snake to stretch. As Snake stretched out, Anansi tied Snake's middle to the bamboo. Encouraging the snake to make one more try and that he only had to stretch 6 more inches to be longer than the bamboo, Snake attempted to stretch one last time. As Snake's head reached the end of the bamboo, Anansi slipped one more rope around Snake's head, tying him completely to the bamboo. All the animals watching had seen Anansi catch a snake all by himself and could not laugh at him anymore. Tiger, defeated, did not dare call the stories Tiger stories again, honouring his agreement that the stories would now bear Anansi's name. The important difference in the Tiger version of the story compared to the Sky God version is the intent of the original holder of the stories. While Nyame may guard the stories, when Anansi proves himself worthy of taking ownership of the stories, Nyame praises Anansi and joins the people in celebrating Anansi's success. Tiger, on the other hand, sets Anansi a task that he sees as impossible in order to humiliate him, and all other animals above Anansi in the hierarchy mock and laugh at Anansi's efforts, and the stories are given to Anansi begrudgingly. The dynamic is thought to possibly represent the slave and the plantation owner, the owner's family, the white employees, other white members of the community, and other slaves higher up in the hierarchy, all holding power over Anansi as the lowest slave in the hierarchy. Anansi's attempts to directly catch a snake are all easily thwarted because Anansi is attempting to catch a snake through conventional methods that Snake can easily overcome. So the story is intended to teach slaves the importance of distraction, flattery, and subterfuge by playing on the arrogance of those further up in the hierarchy. These kind of stories would feed into small acts of rebellion in order to humiliate the masters, steal extra food, avoid work, or simply provide other slaves with a greater sense of empowerment and agency than the environment would give. Another Tiger story describes a more overt humiliation of Tiger by Anansi, a story known as Me Father's Old Riding Horse. In this story, Anansi makes the claim to 2 other characters, who are sometimes depicted as pretty ladies, that Tiger, rather than being the authoritative figure that he presents, was, as the title suggests, Anansi's father's old riding horse. Tiger, upon learning this, confronts Anansi, demanding that he tell the ladies he was lying. Anansi feigns an illness, claiming that he is too sick to move, but that he would own up to his lies if Tiger would carry him on his back to meet the ladies. Tiger agrees, and Anansi then requests a saddle, stirrups, and spurs, claiming that he needs them to stay safely on Tiger's back because he is too weak to ride without support. For most of the journey, Anansi keeps up this sick and weak act until, on arrival, he digs the spurs into Tiger, making him gallop into the yard, while Anansi shouts, "Carry him to the stable, sir. I make you to know that what Anansi said is true to the fact. It is my father's old riding horse." So, not only can Anansi trick an animal as strong and dangerous as Tiger, through using subterfuge and manipulation, he can even control Tiger in some circumstances. The important aspect of Tiger that's played upon here is the importance that Tiger places on his reputation. And this taught an important lesson to the slaves, for like Tiger, reputation was important to the plantation owners. How this was used to resist plantation owners is well documented in the diaries of the plantation owner Matthew Lewis, who became a plantation owner in 1812 and kept journals of his visits to the plantation until 1818. After inheriting 2 plantations from his father, he journeyed to Jamaica to inspect them. Some of the plantation slaves, learning of his approaching visit, began to spread a rumour over the plantations that Lewis was bearing a letter from the prominent abolitionist Member of Parliament William Wilberforce, which had been signed by King George, declaring that the slaves were to be set free, but that he could not reveal this to the white people of Jamaica. This rumour led to the slaves giving Lewis such a warm welcome, treating him as a generous and kind benefactor, and showering him with gratitude on his arrival, and so Lewis wanted to live up to this high opinion that they had of him. Lewis would set about rebuking harsh masters on the plantation, attempting to improve conditions, and trying to be the provider and the protector that the slaves were treating him as. Setting up this power dynamic, however false it was, meant that Lewis was much more lenient than other owners when faced with other forms of resistance, such as slow working, non-compliance, feigned incompetence, or even small acts of sabotage that could be passed off as accidents. And most notably, when one slave, named Adam, is accused of attempting to poison other slaves as part of a plan to regain his position as slave driver, Adam's pandering to Lewis's sympathies and moral values has Lewis intervene to ensure that Adam is transported rather than hanged, and Lewis even gives a quite glowing description of Adam's qualities as a worker in his diaries. While we see the characteristics of some slave owners in the character of Tiger, particularly the characteristic of wielding power but being reliant on their reputation, some Anansi stories do offer more overt depictions of white people on the plantation, particularly the characters of Massa, or Master, Bukra, which is a term for other white men on the plantation, King, and Preacher. Massa or Bukra are often unseen figures, and there are stories where Anansi will name drop them to other characters to invoke the threat of their power, while some stories will have Massa or Bukra replacing Tiger as the powerful character who Anansi tricks. Some variants that feature both Massa or Bukra and Tiger will have Anansi playing the 2 powerful characters off against each other. So an example of this is the story Tiger's Sheepskin Suit. In this story, Anansi is tasked with looking after a flock of 2,000 sheep owned by Massa, or sometimes referred to as a man named Mr. Mighty, depending on the storyteller. One by one, Anansi steals the sheep until only one remains. The master says that he will give his best daughter and £200 to whoever finds the sheep thief. Anansi suggests that the master host a ball at his home, and Anansi will expose the thief there. As the master makes these plans, Anansi recruits Tiger to join him in performing at the ball, with Anansi playing the fiddle and Tiger playing the tambourine and singing. Anansi insists that in order to look his best for the performance, Tiger should wear a sheepskin suit that Anansi made. He teaches Tiger a song to perform as well. Anansi would sing the first line, "Mr. Mighty lost his sheep." It sounds like Tiger's the thief. And Tiger would respond with, "For true, brother, for true, I used them to make my clothes." The unsuspecting Tiger did not make the connection with the real stolen sheep or with the costume, and he agreed to this. Anansi told the master that the thief would be obvious at the ball by showing up in new sheepskin clothes. At the ball, when Anansi brought Tiger on stage to sing, and Tiger admitted the crime in the song, the master confronted Tiger while Anansi feigned his ignorance. Tiger received 10 years in prison for the theft, while Anansi received a reward of £200 and the master's daughter, and of course, meat and skins from 2,000 stolen sheep. So, while Massa and Bukra are clear depictions of people on the plantations, King is a more difficult character to interpret. I can only find one King story called Young Kyung Pyung, which sounds quite similar to one of the stories that you told earlier, Charles. Though fortunately the names I have to pronounce in mine are much easier. The story tells of a king who lives across the river on the side of the forest farthest from Anansi's village. The king has 3 daughters and no one knew their names. Wise men had come from all over the world to guess their names, but none had succeeded. The wisest of the animals had also attempted to guess the names, and none had. So Anansi devises a plan. First, he learns when the girls go down to the river to swim. While they're away, he fills a basket with all kinds of fruit, arranges flowers around the rim, and he hides it in their bedroom. He then lies in wait for them. Upon their return, one of the girls discovers the basket and sings to her sisters, "Young Kyung Pyung, what a pretty basket. Margaret Powell alone, what a pretty basket." The next girl sings in reply, "Eggy Law, what a pretty basket. Margaret Powell alone, what a pretty basket." The third girl finishes with, "Eggy Law, what a pretty basket. Young Kyung Pyung, what a pretty basket." And the 3 take the basket to show the king. Now knowing the girls' names, Anansi returns home and gathers a group of musicians, Rat with his drum, Crow with his fiddle, and Bullfrog with his trumpet. He spends a week teaching them a tune to play, promising to pay them on Saturday. On Saturday, they return to the king's palace, and outside, Anansi tells them to begin playing, while he sings along with Young Kyung Pyung, Eggy Law, Margaret Powell alone. The queen, hearing this, demands to know who is singing the names of her daughters. Anansi and his musicians play louder, until the king also demands to know who is singing his daughters' names. Anansi and his musicians march into the palace, and the king shouts, "You, Anansi, I should have known it would be you. Take what you wish from my palace, but be out of the country in an hour and never come back." Crow, Bullfrog, and Anansi all take gold and silver, taking as much as they can carry. With Anansi taking so much, he has to drag his bag along the ground, as it is too heavy to lift. Rat, however, was cleverer than the others, and he took Young Kyung Pyung as his wife. The king allowed him to live in the palace, but made Rat promise to never play the drum again. So the king, in this case, I think, is likely a local governor or someone with important social standing outside the plantation. And the story illustrates not only the power of gathering information, but also of ensuring you use it correctly. Had Anansi simply gone to the king and told him the names, the king could have denied that Anansi was correct, or could have punished him. Instead, Anansi made such a spectacle of revealing the names that the king could not deny Anansi a reward.
Is it possible that they actually just mean the King of England or something like that? Because at the time, Britain would have ruled Jamaica.
Yeah, it is possible because obviously, like I mentioned before, they understood the political structure and that the King of England had power over them. So it is possible that King was just the King of England.
Yeah.
By me trying to read it as what lessons are in this, I guess I tried to put King into a more practical role for the slaves.
No, I think you're probably right to do so. It's probably less. It may be less likely that it is an actual real figure. It may just be like as you say, an immediate authority figure.
Yeah. And this story does also have another trope that's quite common that does make me think king is a more immediate authority figure than the literal king of England.
Yeah.
In that when Rat chose to marry one of the king's daughters instead of taking the money, this trope of a character representing a slave marrying the daughter of one of the white people is quite common basically whenever white human women are characters in the stories, because marrying them serves to increase a character's social status and gain him freedom, which is something that was rare but was possible for slaves in Jamaica. But the story also illustrates the price of that, in that they have to assimilate into white culture, represented by the king ordering the rat to never play the drum again.
Yeah.
Another common element of the Jamaican Anansi stories is hunger, and Anansi tricking Tiger, Bukra, Massa, other animals representing slaves, or even his wife and son for food. In fact, in these stories, it is also quite common for Anansi to kill and eat the other animals.
Yeah, that's something I left out of my discussion because I couldn't find the direct story, but according to some scholars, Anansi is like in West African stories is also a cannibal, and even like a fratricidal cannibal as well.
Yeah, I have one story that does illustrate this quite well. So these particular stories illustrate a point that was explained quite well by Emily Zobel Marshall in her book, that Anansi not only taught resistance strategies and a resistance mindset, but that he also taught survival at all costs. They illustrate a particularly harsh reality of life as a slave, but also of life among the maroon communities in Jamaica, which were communities made up of escaped slaves who were allowed a sort of semi-independence. And that reality is that your own survival often came at the cost of your fellow man. Some of these stories do also display Anansi being outwitted by other animals, in particular the monkey. Unlike many of the African stories, we see Anansi as much more fallible than he would be in the African versions, which again illustrates just how harsh the conditions were that these stories were being told in that Anansi was just as much at risk of being killed as anyone else in the story. So, one story that both illustrates the ruthlessness of this Anansi while also showing Monkey outwitting him is the story How Monkey Managed Anansi. So, the story begins with Anansi telling his wife that he would like some fresh meat rather than the salt meat that they would usually have available. When his wife asks what kind of meat, Anansi says he will take any meat at all, and he tells his wife a plan: that they lay a banana barrel on the bed, make it up to look like a man under the bed sheets, and then she should fetch Brother Monkey, Brother Sheep, Brother Goat, Brother Hog, and Parson Cow, the minister, and to tell them that their friend is dying inside the house, and to bring them into the room with him to pay their last respects. However, unbeknownst to Anansi and his wife, Brother Monkey was in the trees above them listening. So, when Anansi's wife fetched the other animals, they found Anansi in the yard crying. Parson Cow attempted to comfort Anansi, telling him that all must walk that road in the end. Anansi ushers the others inside to pay their respects to the old man, but Mrs. Anansi says that they should not lift up the sheet until morning. Monkey, however, says that he and his wife will not go in, that they are too sorry for Anansi and his friend, and if they go in, they will cry all night. Anansi leaves Monkey outside, accepting that Monkey is too clever for him. Anansi locks the door once the others roll inside, and he asks Parson Cow to pray. Throughout the prayer, Anansi cries, and afterwards he asks the cow to sing a hymn. As Cow finishes singing, Anansi shouts that he don't like that hymn, and he will kill Parson Cow, grabbing his cutlass, which I assume in this context is more like a machete, and he uses it to kill Cow. All the others attempt to stop him, but they are unarmed, and so Anansi kills all of them. In the morning, Monkey, knowing what happened, laughs and says that he knows if he had gone inside, Anansi would have done the same to him. Anansi denies this, but still he shares the meat with Monkey. So at this point I've mentioned most of the major characters in the Anansi stories. Before I cover one final character who is somewhat different from the others so far, I will take some time to discuss what Emily Zobel Marshall calls Anansi tactics, which she describes as a form of resistance by the slaves against their masters, and again the mindset of survival at all costs and how they were implemented. So while the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean was not in any way directly attributable to slave rebellion, the regular displays of resistance is thought to have helped make the case that slavery was not humane, nor was it the natural, contented state of Africans, as many slave owners would claim in order to justify themselves. The Anansi tactics that Zobel Marshall describes range from the covert, such as theft and deception, to overt sabotage, such as damaging machinery or burning fields. Simple methods of protest that we see in workplaces today, such as slowdowns or deliberate incompetence, were also seen, and in extreme cases, self-mutilation has even been described. So whether disrupting work, preventing oneself or others from working, damaging the master's reputation, or taking or destroying assets, the goal was more often to harm the master's bottom line rather than to gain freedom. The slaves knew that more often than not, outright rebellion would get them killed, but even though they could not escape their situation, they would not quietly surrender to it. So, in the plantations, there was a quite complex social structure in place. The slaves themselves had a hierarchy, with the field slaves as the lowest status, slave drivers above them, craftsmen above them, and house slaves at the top. White society, including plantation owners, the owner's family, various staff, all obviously stood above slaves in that hierarchy, but many white staff worked closely with the slaves, managing the slave drivers, dealing with the craftsmen, and letting house slaves into their personal space. And so this proximity led to a more complex system of loyalties than the obvious hierarchy would suggest. Family members would favour certain house slaves, the master would have favourites among the female slaves, white employees working directly with craftsmen and field slaves would try and develop something of a rapport with them, and so this sort of blurred the hierarchy in some ways. And this is where the lessons of Anansi stories begin to be of practical use. A house slave who's treated as invisible hears far more about the masters and their guests, be they business partners, family, or friends, than the owners would realise. And so, learning to listen for important information when you're not being seen, and learning how to use that information in a way that ensures your safety, would be a very beneficial lesson for the house slave. A female slave who the master is forcing to sleep with him would know that she has the master's ear when he's vulnerable, and so can put anxieties or a false sense of security into his mind.
I'm just going to jump in here really quickly and just recommend something. So if you want to learn a little bit more about like the lives of house slaves and some of the things they went through, it's not quite the same context, but there is a great episode of the Dollop podcast on the life of Ona Judge, who was the slave of George Washington and who famously famously escaped from him. But I would listen to that if you want to get a different perspective on what the kind of plantation class of American leadership in the early days of the American Republic, what some of the things they got up to, basically. But yeah, sorry, go ahead, Crofty.
That's interesting, actually. I'll give that a listen once we're done here.
It is like 2 hours long, I will warn.
I'll give that a listen tomorrow. So outside of the house, field slaves and craftsmen working closely with supervisors can develop a camaraderie and earn trust to ensure that they're not suspects when a theft occurs, or even that their masters would believe them if they could convincingly point the finger elsewhere. So, while the slaves might have kept up the appearance of obedience, there was always planning going on right under the noses of the masters. So, Matthew Lewis, in his diaries, gives us some more specific examples. He describes a house slave called Cubina, who would adhere to the letter of an order, but in a way that renders the order meaningless. One example was when Cubina was ordered to ensure that all windows in the house were shut every night, as the cats were getting into the house. Cubina would diligently check every window in the house at night, and yet still cats would enter and would cause havoc. After this continued for some time, Lewis asked Cubina how the cats could be getting into the house, only for Cubina to inform Lewis that one of the window panes was broken. Similar story from Lewis's diaries. When feeding the pigeons, Cubina would always startle them upon entering the pigeon house and would have to wait for the rest of the day to ensure that they all returned. When ordered to fit sliders over the holes to prevent the startled pigeons from fleeing, he did so when the pigeons were outside, leaving them closed so that they could not get back in. He then sat and waited in the pigeon house for the pigeons to return. On a slightly larger scale, Lewis describes an occurrence when the slaves were celebrating his arrival and the cattle drivers accidentally left a gate open, leaving the cattle to escape during the festivities and to trample a cane field. He would describe a cook as adhering too strictly to his requests and complaints. For example, a single request for salt meat one day would lead to only cooking salt meat for some time, leaving all of the fresh meat to go off. And when he complains about too much salt meat, she then cooks all of the remaining fresh meat, wasting it quickly. He also describes a carpenter who, when ordered to make a box for sweetmeats, makes one too small for a single jar, then one so large that it would hold 20 jars. And when he finally gets the correct proportions, he mistakenly nails the lid shut.
That's some good disobedience. I'm admiration of that. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. As well as these individual acts, the inflating of Lewis's reputation as a kind master that I described earlier on was such an effective strategy that it actually spread beyond his own plantation and further to all the surrounding plantations. So slaves from other estates would bring their grievances to Lewis and would ask him to intervene with their masters on their behalf, disrupting both his own management of the plantation and disrupting work elsewhere. So Zobel Marshall argues that by this time, Lewis is probably aware of the slaves' efforts to manipulate him, and he is actually playing the role of the powerful but foolish master described in the stories. And this suggestion is supported by the fact that he documented so many of these tactics, while also expressing admiration for the slaves and sympathy for their plight.
Yeah, I have to jump in and say it's always interesting when you see these slave owners saying, "Oh, it's so horrible. This thing I'm doing to them is so horrible for them." I just have to point out, he may, in the grand scheme of the times, have been a more tolerant master. He's still garbage. I just want to point out.
Yes, I'm not in any way trying to claim that he is a good person.
Oh no, I wasn't accusing you of that. I just felt like I just felt like it had gone on enough where we just needed to have that statement on the record. Yeah.
His diaries are a very useful resource, but yes, we should not be putting any praise on him in any way.
Just remind me, what period was his life in again? What was it, when did he live between?
So he acquired the plantation in 1812, and managed it until 1818.
Okay, this is well into massive abolition in movements going on in the northern US and stuff like that. So it's in other areas around the Western Hemisphere. It's not a case of he's in 1700 at the height of the trade or anything like that.
No. Like I say, when he first arrived, the rumour that was spread was that the MP William Wilberforce, who was one of the main figures behind the abolitionist movement in Britain, had given him a letter to take to Jamaica. So we are getting towards abolition in Jamaica. There is a lot of abolitionist sentiment in the UK, in Great Britain at the time.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I'm just trying to head off preemptively the argument that's been used to try and minimise slavery of saying that everyone was doing it at the time. They would have been shamed by their peers if they'd gone against it. And it's like, no, there's clearly people around who were going against it at this time, and there always were. Yeah.
Whereas, like I say, by this point, there is quite a big contingent in the British Parliament in favour of abolition. So it's definitely not just accepted by everyone anymore.
I mean, we're within a couple of decades of it being abolished, really, at this point. Although not, obviously, the way it was abolished was not perfect and took a lot of time to actually result in that, but oh well.
Yeah, it was 1838 it was abolished in Jamaica. So pretty much 2 decades out.
Slavery was abolished in 1833. It was a gradual abolition. So I can see how in 1838 it would take until 1838 to happen in Jamaica.
Yeah. So as we've just covered, the political winds at this point were shifting towards abolition for quite some time, and as abolition became a more real possibility, there were instances of overt armed rebellion, and Zobel Marshall makes direct comparisons between aspects of these rebellions and Anansi stories. So one attempted rebellion in 1776, which is called the Hanover Rebellion, had aimed to set up Jamaica as a republic ran by former slaves, and the plot involved over 8,500 slaves from 43 estates.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was a pretty huge one.
Some coordination there,
Yeah, it didn't quite get into a full-blown rebellion because of quite a small thing, actually. So it was quite an extensive plot that failed because one slave was discovered to have hidden a gun, and upon being arrested, that slave gave up the plot, and so that prevented any rebellion. So I probably missed important details in that because it's just a short description, but that's the gist of it. Zobel Marshall points to one important element of the Hanover plot, which mirrors a recurring point in Anansi stories, which is the use of funerals as cover or as a ruse. While there doesn't seem to be a historical parallel of using a funeral as a lure to trap and murder victims, as I described in How Monkey Managed Anansi, the common theme of sham funerals in other Anansi stories reflects the use of funerals to disguise plotting and communication between groups of slaves, or as a distraction. So when the plot was discovered, it was revealed that all of the planning had taken place at Sunday worship or at funerals, and many people had noted that in the preceding months there was an uncommonly high attendance at all the funerals they'd observed. A rebellion that got much further than the Hanover Rebellion occurred in 1831, so just a couple of years before abolition, and this was the largest of slave rebellions, known as the Emancipation Rebellion or the Christmas Rebellion. This revolt had smaller goals than the previous one. While it sought to bring an end to slavery, it did not seek to reject British colonial rule. So this rebellion was stirred by a rumour that King William IV had declared all black people to have been freed, and that the masters in Jamaica had kept this information from the slaves and were defying the king. The mastermind behind this rumour was Sam Sharp, who was a Baptist preacher who took advantage of his position and of his oration skills to stir up a revolt, working the fake story of abolition into his sermons and encouraging freedmen to spread the news far and wide. While Sharp's original plan was to lead the slaves in non-violent resistance, after the Jamaican Assembly denied the slaves the promised holiday following Christmas that year, the organised slaves took up arms. Sharp would travel from estate to estate, rallying troops, and they would begin to light beacon fires to signal to others to take up arms. So that day, some 20,000 slaves revolted, taking control of much of the western side of the island within a week and cutting off communications for the government. So Zobel Marshall describes the rebels' tactics as Anansi tactics, and they are what we may now call guerrilla warfare. It involved using ambush, misdirection, the ability to quickly vanish into dense forests or hidden caves, and having non-violent sympathisers lie, distract, or protest innocence when interrogated. The rebellion lasted roughly a month, causing more than £1 million of property damage. 214 slaves were killed in action. However, only 14 white troops were killed, and 344 slaves were executed in the aftermath. Though these slaves claimed that they preferred death to bondage, and they faced their fate calmly and with dignity. Zobel Marshall here makes a comparison to another Anansi story, suggesting that Sharp's use of his preaching to incite rebellion might have been directly inspired by the story Anansi in Crab Country. In this story, Anansi travels as a minister, preaching across the land until he gets to Crab Country, where Mr. Crab will not listen to his preaching. So Anansi leaves and gathers followers, the toad, the rat, and the blackbird. He convinces them to play instruments and to join in his preaching, and while Crab doesn't understand, he becomes used to their loud music. When Crab is used to their music and their preaching, Anansi invites him to a baptism at his house. He has his followers play their music as loudly and as vigorously as they can before baptizing them for Crab to see. Upon seeing Anansi do this, Crab says he would like to be baptized too. Anansi says that he must wait until tomorrow. In the meantime, Anansi gets his friends to prepare to boil the water to baptize Crab. The next day, Anansi has Crab get in a deep barrel, telling him he will add water in a moment. Once Crab is in the barrel, Anansi pours in the boiling water, cooking him so that Anansi and his friends can eat him. So, the use of Anansi's status as a preacher here travel unhindered, to gather followers with his oratory, and to incite them to violence, all without being suspected by Crab, and simply being seen as devoted to his religion, is a potential parallel to Sharp's actions, and it is plausible that such a story helped inspire his plans. So, as we said earlier, slavery in Jamaica ended between 1833 and 1838. However, the newly freed black population continued to suffer oppression, poor conditions, hunger, menial work, low pay, and very limited basic rights. For quite some time, many feared for the possibility of Jamaica joining the United States as a slave state and the loss of their newfound freedoms. And in this time, Anansi stories remained popular as tales of survival and resistance to racial oppression. There's obviously much more to the history of slavery and emancipation in Jamaica than can be covered in the scope of this podcast, and I couldn't even begin to do it justice. So Emily Zobel Marshall's book is a good source there. Levine's book that I referenced earlier on as well. So to move away from the discussion of slavery and Anansi's position as a resistance figure, I will now discuss one aspect of the Anansi stories in Jamaica that did retain a connection to the supernatural, as while the Aken Asante religion didn't survive in Jamaica, and instead Christianity was enforced on slaves, many beliefs and rituals surrounding death and Anansi's connection to them did survive. So Anansi stories would become an important feature in a mourning ritual called Nine Night. So Nine Night is a tradition which originated in Africa and remained throughout slavery and emancipation, and still exists today in Jamaica, Suriname, Trinidad and St. Vincent. Following a funeral, an extended wake is held over the next 8 days, in which friends and family come together in the home of the deceased to share memories, to share food and to sing hymns. On the 9th night is the final sit-up, as it's described, in which traditional drum music and dancing takes place, and games are played in order to celebrate the life of the deceased. In between the music and the dancing, the mourners eat and drink together and share Anansi stories. The Anansi stories told in this context are the more humorous ones, because there must be no sadness, and also no one must speak ill of the dead at this time, else the ghost will haunt them. Some also say that the Anansi stories are told to entertain the ghost of the deceased and to help them depart in peace. These stories are described as being accompanied by rude activities carried out rudely in the form of games, songs and dances that would not otherwise be socially acceptable. And so this is perhaps the last place where Anansi retained his African role as a disruptor of social boundaries. The storytellers for the occasion would in many cases be outsiders, particularly young men living alone and working as performers. And by bringing them into the home and bringing street performances into the house, they break a social boundary between community and private spaces, which is described as embodying Anansi as the Lord of Nonsense.
I'm also wondering if there's any, this may be a spurious connection I'm making, but something I didn't really go into in my section just for time is that one interpretation, I think it's by Christopher Vex, says that a powerful part of Anansi's symbology in amongst the Akan peoples, his loner status, which very much subverts the priorities of a normal society. And I'm wondering if these loner figures being brought in, if there's any parallel to be found there. But that maybe just be a connection that I'm not making. Because fundamentally, Anansi in Africa is an outsider figure, and that's the embracing of the outsider in this circumstance seems to resemble his status in Africa.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't think it's said explicitly, but I think basically everything that I've read does fit that description, yeah. So, by disrupting these social norms in this way, it's said to help the community understand the in-between status of the deceased following their burial, come to terms with their passing, and allow the deceased to move on and allow the living to carry on in the face of death. This connection with death does persist in a few of the stories themselves. There's at least 3 stories in which Death himself appears as a character. Brother Anansi and Brother Death, how Death came to the city, and Anansi meets Brother Death. Brother Death was one of the few beings to hold any power over Anansi, though Anansi in some cases was still able to trick Death. In Brother Anansi and Brother Death, Anansi has married his daughter to Brother Death, and he imposes on his new son-in-law for food. Death remains silent while Anansi prepares and cooks all of Death's food. After Anansi eats it all, Death grabs him, saying, "I'm not going to let you go again," before locking Anansi in a room while he fetches his spear to kill Anansi. In this room, Anansi discovers the body of his daughter, and when Death returns, Anansi calls Death a brute for killing his daughter and manages to give Death the slip and flee home. Death follows, and Anansi takes the rest of his family up to the roof and has them hang from the roof where Death cannot reach them. Death patiently waits for them. Anansi's sons and his wife cannot outlast Death, and as they tire, Anansi tells each of them to drop. Death captures them, but doesn't kill them yet, waiting for Anansi to drop so he can kill them all together. As Anansi tires, he warns Death, "I'm going to drop, but me being so fat, if you don't want my fat to go to waste, go and fetch something to catch me." He tells Death to bring a barrel of flour from the next room to catch him. Death does so, not knowing that the barrel contains temper lime, or calcium hydroxide as we now call it, a highly corrosive substance which is used in small amounts to neutralise the acidity in sugarcane juice when crystallising sugar from it. As Death places the barrel below Anansi, Anansi drops directly onto Death's head, plunging him headfirst into the lime and blinding him, and so allowing Anansi and his family to escape. On the other hand, in How Death Came to the City, we see Anansi defeated by Death and him bringing consequences on the entire village. During a famine, Anansi goes out to hunt in the bush for food. Quite some time, he finds no meat, venturing deeper until he finds the village in the woods where Death resides. Death is seated at the gate to the village. Anansi greets Death and tells him his problem, and Death offers to cook food for him. Death cooked more meat than Anansi could eat, and Anansi realises why there is no meat in the bush, because Death owns it all. Anansi explains that he wishes to feed his family and asks if he can take some of the excess meat back to them. Death agrees, and Anansi returns with food, telling his wife what happened and that he could go and visit Death and take meat whenever necessary. However, Anansi was greedy, and he returned to Death's village several times while Death was away, stealing meat from him. Death, noticing that his meat was going missing, waited in secret to watch for the thief. Upon ambushing Anansi, Anansi fled, but while he remained ahead, he could not outrun Death. As he reached the city, seeing that Death was still on his heels, he shouted out to the people that Death was coming and they should shut their doors if they wanted to live. But many could not lock their doors in time, and Death took them. So now Death lives in the city, and had Anansi not stolen from him, he would have remained quietly in the bush where no one could find him. So, now that we've discussed the traditions surrounding Anansi during slavery in Jamaica, to conclude the episode, I'm going to cover how Anansi survives to the present day, and in doing so, compare his development to that of another African trickster who was brought to the New World. Emancipation in Jamaica led to a large surge in interest for African folklore, and Anansi stories in particular, among the white people of Jamaica. Zobel Marshall describes a sense of panic among folklorists that black folklore and black culture would die an untimely death, which I think patronising might be a word for it there.
Yeah.
Very much assuming that black people could not actually preserve their own culture, which...
Yeah, the people who've been very obviously maintaining their own oral culture for hundreds of years, yeah.
Yeah. We will see just how wrong they were later on, at least.
I think one misconception is a lot of people have this perception that like a myth or or folklore is like a static thing that you've got to take a snapshot of to retain. Whereas a lot of other cultures, the attitude is that it's supposed to change and evolve. That's the whole point. Like I was saying with the Akan culture, where the idea that new Abasom could just arise, and if it's recognised by the Akan peoples, then it is worshipped. It was, I think that's some of the thinking going on from kind of authors. I mean, especially kind of from Christian-influenced authors who have a very static idea of what the theology should be these days.
We've had a few of those criticisms of Christianized versions before of myths.
Yeah.
Last time R.S. Rattray came up, for example. So before emancipation, Anansi stories were known to the white people of Jamaica through the stories that nurses would tell the children in their care. Initially, following emancipation, a number of middle-class white women set about collecting Anansi stories and publishing them, including Pamela Milne Holm, who was the daughter of a British officer stationed in Jamaica, Ada Wilson Trowbridge, a scholar from a colonial family, artist Pamela Coleman Smith, and the folklorist Una or Wona Jeffrey Smith. These were the first instances of Anansi stories being written down, and to the small credit of the people collecting them, they did attempt to maintain the Jamaican patois that was used by the black storytellers. During this time, some 40 Anansi stories were collected between these writers. Their works, however, are generally thought to have missed the point of the Anansi stories somewhat. Most white people at the time, like we've said, were completely oblivious to the hidden meanings of the stories that we've discussed, being complacent in their belief that they were superior to the black population. And so the stories were instead described as quaint traditions of the West Indian peasantry. As I said at the start, the white people viewing these stories that way was a part of their power during slavery, as they could be told right under the noses of the slaves' masters and the masters' families, and even told directly to the masters' children, without the masters picking up on the double meanings, the lessons, and the veiled criticisms of them. But this quality, of course, made preserving them in writing quite difficult, particularly since reading and writing were still kept from many black people at the time, and so the stories were transcribed by people who did not know the nuances of them because of their privileged positions. In 1907, the most comprehensive collection of Anansi stories was collected and published by the former British clergyman Robert Jekyll, who had been living in Jamaica for 34 years at that point. And this collection is the one I mentioned in my references, which I've used a few stories from. So his book, Jamaican Song and Story, collected 51 Anansi stories, as well as 145 folk songs from the descendants of Jamaican slaves. As well as collecting the stories, the book's introduction explained what was known of their origins, and Jekyll explained aspects of the Jamaican dialect in which they were written, and defined certain common elements. For example, each story in Jekyll's collection ends with the line, "Jack Mantora, me no choose none." According to Jekyll, Jack Mantora referred to a fictitious member of the audience, and the line, "me no choose none," specifies that the moral or the lesson or the warning or the criticism or the punishment that fell on Anansi, that is referred to in the story, is not intended to be directed at any specific member of the audience. Jekyll here did seem to be approaching these stories with the idea of a European fable or a parable, and so, again, like the authors before him, missed much of the underlying meaning. And just how much he missed that is highlighted by the dedication in which he ends his preface, which I'm going to quote. I'm going to remove one adjective he used for the people of Jamaica, but apart from that, I'm quoting it verbatim. "The book as a whole is a tribute to my love for Jamaica and its inhabitants, with their winning ways and their many good qualities, among which is to be reckoned that supreme virtue, cheerfulness." So while we've discussed that many Anansi stories did have cheerful and comedic qualities, clearly Jekyll was not privy to any of the hidden meanings that we've been discussing.
You almost have like a vision of him sat there, just like, oh wow, this is a grand old time, and just completely oblivious. Yeah,
pretty much. This theme would continue in future collections of Anansi stories, such as the collection by the Jamaican-born professor at the University of the West Indies, Sir Philip Manderson Sherlock, who collected stories in the 1950s, and he would also share this tone of humorous folklore. The intent of these authors was to preserve the Afro-Caribbean culture for future generations and to celebrate the stories, even though it did lead to the loss of the resistance element of the stories, and like we say, is somewhat patronising to the people of Jamaica.
Yeah, that's one of those where you kind of look at it and you go, at least you were trying.
Yeah,
yeah. didn't do the best job because of your unconscious biases, but at least you were trying.
Yeah, the intent is much better than the intent of certain American writers, who I'll be talking about soon. So, at the same time as these white writers were compiling their collections, the black population of the Caribbean did keep up the tradition of oral storytelling, and so the more defiant nature of the stories survives to this day in Caribbean culture. In fact, much of the reason that the publication of Anansi stories was so slow was because black Jamaicans would guard them so carefully. So Una Jeffrey Smith claimed that many of the black women would, upon being asked if they could share an Anansi story with her, claim, "I don't know none." Jeffrey Smith knew that this was a lie, knowing how widespread the stories were, and believed it to be from shame at the ugliness of the Jamaican dialect. Zobel Marshall, however, believes that this was another act of resistance. By denying knowledge of the Anansi stories, black Jamaicans protected their culture from white scholars who would not pick up the story's significance. And so, because of this, it wasn't until much later that the hidden meanings of Anansi stories, as well as the hidden meanings of many slave songs, would become more well known. And so, the spirit of the stories survives today in Jamaica. Following independence from the British Empire in 1962, Anansi experienced a resurgence in Jamaica and is now considered something of a national hero, though there is some controversy today about the telling of stories in schools because of their subversive nature. So, while Anansi is a national hero now, this could have gone very differently. And another trickster figure serves as an example of how Anansi stories could have changed had the former slaves been more willing to share them. So, I am talking, of course, about the character we mentioned earlier, Brer Rabbit, who is a similar trickster figure who originated in South, Central, and Eastern Africa. Brer Rabbit's stories in Africa covered many of the same themes as Anansi stories. At the start of this episode, I admitted to having no previous familiarity with Anansi. Brer Rabbit, on the other hand, I do remember from my childhood, in the form of the Brer Rabbit and Friends books by the English author Enid Blyton, who is also known for characters such as Noddy and the Famous Five. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I became aware that Brer Rabbit wasn't just a whimsical children's character from the same author who created a friendly wooden doll living in Toy Town. I found this out when I learned about the controversial Disney movie Song of the South.
Oh, God.
I'm not going to...
Yeah.
If you're aware of Song of the South...
Song of the South.
You have an idea where I'm going with this.
The less said about Song of the South, the better. It's actually very hard to get hold of these days because Disney have scrubbed it effectively from everywhere that they possibly can.
Which I'm very glad of.
I have seen it. The two things I will say is it commits two major sins. The first is it presents Southern American slavery as a happy place where the slaves accepted their lot, which is a fantastically racist depiction of how that brutal and cruel society worked. And it also commits the sin of being really boring.
Because that's the important bit. So, yeah, that description of Song of the South is a result of a lot of what I'm about to describe. So, to the slaves who were brought to America, Brer Rabbit stories served very much the same function as Anansi stories. Like we've seen with Anansi, the stories would be used to mock the slave owners and teach lessons of survival and resistance, while at the same time, nurses would be telling these stories to the white children of the slave owners. And so the majority of the upper class of the southern states grew up viewing Brer Rabbit stories as a part of their own childhood. However, following the abolition of slavery in the US in 1865, the interest in retaining these stories had a very different intent to the Anansi stories. Many white people in the southern US mourned the loss of what they called the good old days of slavery and plantation life, and rather than viewing the collection of Brer Rabbit stories as preserving the folklore of a culture, they instead collected and published them as nostalgia for a romanticised past, where slaves were content with their lot, loyal to their masters, found happiness in their hard work, and understood their place in the world. The most notorious offender here of using Brer Rabbit stories as an attempt to legitimise slavery is the journalist and author Joel Chandler Harris. Harris was the son of an Irish immigrant and an unknown father who began apprenticing for a Confederate newspaper in Georgia at 14 years old during the Civil War. He was provided room and board by the newspaper's owner on Turnwold Plantation near the town of Eatonton, and it was here that he developed an interest in black folklore through spending much of his time off in the slave quarters. And he would claim that his Irish ancestry and illegitimate birth would help him foster an intimate connection with the slaves. Following the Civil War, he became a journalist for the Atlanta Constitution newspaper. It was here that he began compiling Brer Rabbit stories. For these collections, he created the character of Uncle Remus, a kind, elderly former slave telling stories to entertain and teach the white children, whom Harris described in the introduction of his first collection as having nothing but pleasant memories of the discipline of slavery. Yeah, that was a difficult sentence to read.
Yeah.
So, Uncle Remus was one of the first of the popular and problematic archetype of the wise, kindly old black person that we would see in marketing, such as Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima, and would lead to a fictional trope known as the magical Negro, which is perhaps most well known for Stephen King characters such as Dick Halloran or Mother Abigail.
Yeah, John Coffey as well.
John Coffey, yep. How did I miss him? So, despite this nostalgia for slavery that Harris is trying to convey, across the 8 Uncle Remus collections that Harris published between 1880 and 1910, many of the stories that Remus told did contain some of the same themes we see in Anansi. The supposedly weaker character of Brer Rabbit outwitting characters who were an allegory for white people, such as Brer Fox, or in some cases even directly naming slave owners or plantation owners themselves. One story that Uncle Remus tells to the white child has Brer Rabbit stealing from the child's own mother, evading punishment by incriminating Brer Fox. In stories such as these, Harris did depict the same tactics of resistance that we see in the Anansi stories. However, Harris took much of the sting out of the attacks on plantation owners that the stories represent by framing them through the character of Uncle Remus, and so turning them from resistance into simple mischief. Harris would also go to pains to emphasise that these stories were African in origin, so they could not have been intended as criticism of slavery, because they existed before slavery began. Again, illustrating that point that you made about white Europeans seeing folklore as fixed rather than as an evolving thing.
Yeah.
The argument that Harris is making is further complicated, though, by several 20th century writers who tried to justify the appropriation of Brer Rabbit stories by claiming that Brer Rabbit must actually be European in origin. Some through being overt about their racist reasoning for doing so, claiming that Africans weren't intelligent enough to have come up with these stories themselves, while some tried to back it up with some very bad explanations of folktale archetypes that were created from entirely European folktales and trying to sort of shoehorn Brer Rabbit into one of these archetypes. So, through the work of Harris and similar authors, Brer Rabbit lost much of his status as a resistance figure, instead starring in books and a Disney movie, which expressed nostalgia for slavery, and becoming known, at least in the UK, as simply a whimsical children's character. And it's also worth noting that if you look on the Wikipedia page for Brer Rabbit, Joel Chandler Harris is listed as one of the creators of the character.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So, while Anansi may be less well known outside of Africa, the Caribbean, and the African diaspora, much of what made Anansi a powerful figure is preserved because of that. And I think we end it there.
Yes, indeed. So it's probably been a bit of a hard listen for people at home today. I know our research was certainly a hard process.
Yeah.
I just wanted to end by saying there are quite a variety of other trickster figures to be found elsewhere in Africa, which we will talk a little bit about in this upcoming mini episode that we're going to do. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the figures of Eshu and Legba, who went through a very similar transformative process, moving from Africa to the Caribbean. After that, however, we will be doing more of a full episode. So, Crofty, do you want to maybe give us a few hints as to what that might be?
For a start, it will be this year's, what I've come to call creature feature.
Yeah.
We will be taking a particularly magical creature from various parts of Europe and discussing different interpretations.
Probably one of the most prolific creatures to appear in all of folklore, I've got to say.
Yeah, I think so.
And for anyone that really, for anyone who was paying attention at home, actually appeared at one point in this episode.
And I will also say that we will be careful not to say that we don't believe in them.
Hopefully the next time will be a little bit sooner than this time. I know we said at the end of Beowulf that we were going to try and get this out a little bit quicker, but just conflicts of time and events and the world at large prevented us from doing that. So hopefully we will be back to talk to you folks about that again soon.
Yeah, neither of us are planning to move house or country in the next 2 months, so
I'm gonna move my house a country over just to spite that statement. Okay, so thank you all for listening this far, folks. If you enjoyed what you listened to, we do have a Patreon over at patreon.com/the_histocrat. And if you're listening to the audio version of this, you can always check over on YouTube for a version with a few visuals added. And that usually comes out about a month after the audio release. And if you're watching this over on YouTube, you can always check out the audio version of this as well. It's been released as a podcast under Mythillogical Podcast on all the major platforms. All right, folks. Thank you for listening. And I think I should sign off in the appropriate manner by saying this, our story, which we have related, if it be sweet or if it be not sweet, take some elsewhere and let some come back to us.
and I'll just say see you next time.